My name is Daniel Mercer. I'm not an investigator. I'm not law enforcement. I document abandoned places. That's it. Old motels, closed factories, forgotten campsites. I go in, I film what's left behind, and I leave. I don't go looking for trouble. About 3 weeks ago, I visited a place called Briar Hollow campground. It's been shut down for nearly a year. A few people have disappeared in the surrounding region, and some locals reported strange sightings at night. I didn't go there to chase rumors. I went because it was empty. At least I thought it was. I'm recording this now because I need a clear account of what happened while I still trust my memory. There are details that feel harder to hold onto each day. Small things, subtle things. If you're watching this, just understand, I stayed 2 nights. And I should have left after the first one. I didn't choose Briar Hollow because of the disappearances. That's important. If you start with the assumption that I went there looking for something wrong, then everything I tell you after that sounds biased, like I expected it, like I wanted something to happen. I didn't. Briar Hollow campground closed 8 months ago. Official reason: declining visitors and environmental concerns. That was the phrasing on the county website, vague enough to mean nothing. The disappearances were separate incidents, scattered across nearby trails and rural roads over the past year. 3 confirmed, 2 still classified as missing persons. Statistically, that doesn't make a pattern. At least that's what I told myself. I document abandoned places for a living, not full-time, but enough that I treat it seriously. I research locations. I check access points. I plan entry and exit routes. I don't trespass recklessly. I don't stay overnight unless I've assessed the risk. Briar Hollow looked easy. Satellite images showed a small main lodge, a ring of individual campsites, a maintenance shed, and an old ranger station near the tree line. The place wasn't deep wilderness. A highway sat less than 5 miles away. No cult rumors, no urban legends, just a campground that shut down quietly. That kind of quiet usually means paperwork, not horror. I arrived just before sunset. The entrance gate hung open, not broken, just open. One hinge sagged slightly, like it had been pushed too many times without care. The parking lot was empty. No graffiti, no smashed windows, no signs of vandalism. That was the first thing that unsettled me, though I didn't recognize it as unease at the time. Abandoned places decay quickly when people discover them. They attract damage. Briar Hollow looked paused. The lodge windows were dusty, but intact. A corkboard near the entrance still held faded maps of hiking trails. A laminated campfire safety poster peeled at one corner. It didn't feel looted. It felt left. I told myself that meant the closure had been orderly. Inside the lodge, chairs were stacked on tables. A coffee machine sat unplugged behind the counter. There were no personal belongings, no forgotten wallets, no scattered panic. If something had happened here, it hadn't happened fast. That thought lingered longer than it should have. I set up my camera and began recording. Standard documentation. Wide shots first, then slow pans of details. Cracked tile, a guest sign-in book behind the counter. That book is where things started connecting. The final entries were from late summer last year. Normal families, 2-night reservations, RV hookups. Then 3 days before the last entry, I noticed something strange. 3 campsites were circled in red ink on the internal map attached to the back cover. Sites 12, 14, and 17. There was no note explaining why. I assumed it was maintenance, maybe water line repairs. Still, I photographed it. By the time I finished filming the lodge, the sun had lowered enough to flatten the light into long, gray streaks across the clearing. I decided to stay the night. Not inside the lodge. I prefer controlled isolation. I chose campsite 9. Clear line of sight to the main path, close enough to my vehicle. No thick tree covered directly overhead. The forest surrounding Briar Hollow wasn't dense, but it was tall. Pines mostly, straight trunks, sparse undergrowth. That kind of forest carries sound differently. I cooked a small meal and reviewed my footage. Everything looked normal, which is when I heard the first thing that didn't. A zipper. Not mine. I froze, listening. It didn't repeat. No footsteps followed. No voices, just whine through branches. I told myself it could have been an animal brushing fabric somewhere. Maybe one of the abandoned tents I hadn't checked yet. Still, I marked the time on my phone. 11:42 p.m. I didn't sleep well. That wasn't fear. It was anticipation. When you stay alone in abandoned places, your brain expects stimuli. It heightens everything. The smallest shift in temperature feels deliberate. At 2:17 a.m., I woke up to the sound of something metallic tapping. Slow, irregular. I lay still in my sleeping bag, counting intervals. The tapping stopped when I unzipped the tent. The clearing looked unchanged, except campsite 12 was closer than I remembered. That doesn't make sense, I know that. But when I stood there in the moonlight, I was certain the numbered post for Site 12 hadn't been that near to mine before. I walked toward it to confirm. The ground between us showed no drag marks, no disturbance. The map in my phone still showed the same layout, but the spacing felt compressed. I forced myself to measure steps. From my tent to the fire ring of Site 12, 26 paces. Earlier that evening, I would have sworn it was at least 40. Memory distortion under stress is common, I know that. Except I hadn't been stressed. I returned to my tent and did not sleep again. Morning made everything look ordinary. Measured again, 41 paces. Exactly as I first thought. That's when the unease stopped being environmental and started becoming internal. If I was misjudging space at night, I needed to understand why. After packing my gear, I decided to walk the perimeter trail that looped behind sites 12, 14, and 17. The red-circled sites. That was when I noticed the pattern. Those 3 sites were slightly lower in elevation than the others. Not visibly at first glance, but enough that rainwater would collect there before draining. The soil was darker, damp, even though it hadn't rained in days. Behind Site 14, near the tree line, I found something half buried. A metal stake. Not a tent stake. It was thicker, industrial, driven deep into the ground. There were 3 more in a rough triangle pattern, and faint wiring long since severed. I crouched, brushing soil away. It wasn't random debris. It had been installed intentionally, and removed just as intentionally. That's when the logic started forming. Environmental concerns, water pooling, electrical stakes, red-circled campsites. Something had been set up here, something that required containment. I walked to Site 17. Same damp soil, same subtle depression, and a faint chemical smell I couldn't place. Not rot, not fuel, something sterile, clinical. I felt watched then, not in the cinematic sense, in the statistical sense. If something was hidden here, someone would want to know if it was disturbed. I turned slowly. The forest line hadn't moved, but the silence had thickened. No birds, no insects, just the faintest sound of wind traveling through tall pine needles. And underneath it, that metallic tapping again. Not from the clearing, from beneath my feet. I stepped back instinctively. The tapping stopped. My mind tried to rationalize. Old irrigation pipes shifting, thermal expansion, animals underground. but none of those explanations accounted for the stakes, or the wiring, or the fact that all three circled sites formed a perfect triangle. I returned to the lodge to search for maintenance records. If this was environmental testing, there would be documentation. Behind the counter, in a locked cabinet I had initially ignored, I found a thin binder. No official header, just printed forms, each labeled Acoustic Survey Log. Dates aligned with the final weeks before closure. The logs described subsurface resonance anomalies, frequency readings, increased amplitude at night. The notes became more frantic over time. Pattern response observed. Signal appears reactive. Recommend discontinuation of public occupancy. The final entry read: resonance no longer localized. No explanation followed. My throat tightened. This wasn't folklore. This wasn't disappearances caused by random wilderness accidents. Something under those campsites responded to sound, and it had spread. I stepped outside and listened. The forest remained still. Then I understood something I hadn't considered. What if it wasn't reacting to loud noise? What if it was reacting to rhythm? Footsteps, voices, zippers, metal tapping, structured vibration. I replayed the previous night in my head. The tapping beneath Site 12, the zipper sound, my measured steps, each action, each sound, a call, a test, a response. My pulse accelerated, not from fear but from clarity. If the resonance had spread beyond the triangle, that meant the containment failed. And if it reacted to human rhythm, then disappearances weren't random. They were patterned. The missing people had been hikers, campers, people moving in structured cadence through the woods, generating repeatable vibrations. Something below was learning those patterns and answering. I felt the ground beneath me with my palm. Still, quiet, waiting. For the first time since arriving, I considered leaving immediately. Not because I believed something would grab me, but because I understood that staying would teach it more. And the most terrifying thought wasn't that it was intelligent. It was that it was curious. And I had just given it 2 nights of data. I heard the metallic tapping again, this time from directly beneath the lodge. Not loud, not aggressive, measured, like a reply. I stopped moving, and it stopped too. Not random, responsive. I whispered, barely audible. No. The ground vibrated, just slightly, as if something below had leaned closer, and listened. I didn't leave. That's the first decision I replay when I try to sleep. Logically, I should have packed my equipment, driven back to the highway and reported what I found. Anonymous tip. Let the county deal with it. But leaving would have meant accepting that I understood what was happening. And I didn't. Not fully. There's a difference between suspecting a pattern and proving one. I needed confirmation. I told myself that was professional responsibility. If something beneath Briar Hollow posed a genuine risk, documenting it properly mattered. Vague claims about responsive ground vibrations wouldn't convince anyone. I needed evidence, so I changed my approach. If the resonance reacted to rhythm, then I had to remove rhythm. I walked differently that afternoon. No steady cadence, no even spacing between steps. I avoided predictable patterns. I stopped randomly. I doubled back. I scuffed my feet deliberately to create noise without tempo. It felt ridiculous, but the ground stayed quiet. No tapping, no vibration. I exhaled slowly. Then experimentally, I walked 10 steady steps toward Site 12. 1, 2, 3, 4. By step 7, I felt it. Not a shake, not movement. A pressure, subtle rising, like standing on a distant bridge while a train passes miles away. I stopped mid-step. The pressure faded. It wasn't imagining me. It was mapping me. The realization brought a cold, clinical fear. Not panic, not dread, something sharper. If it required structured vibration to localize a target, then it wasn't omniscient. It didn't sense people the way predators smell blood. It triangulated. Through repetition. Through predictability. I backed away from Site 12 without forming a pattern. The ground remained still. That night, I didn't use my tent. Fabric zippers have rhythm. Instead, I sat inside my vehicle with the engine off. Windows cracked slightly. Equipment powered down. No artificial noise. If the phenomenon was expanding beyond the original triangle, I needed to know how far. Midnight passed in silence. At 12:47 a.m., I heard footsteps. Even, measured. Not mine. They came from somewhere, beyond the tree line behind Site 14. Crunch. Pause. Crunch. Pause. Perfect spacing. I held my breath. The steps continued, approaching the clearing. I strained to identify a silhouette among the trees, but the moonlight fractured against branches. Then the tapping began beneath them. Faint at first, then stronger, answering the cadence. The footsteps did not change. They reached the edge of the clearing and stopped. The tapping stopped too. I saw him then. A man standing partially behind a pine trunk. Still, watching. I didn't recognize him. Mid-30s maybe, dark jacket, no visible camping gear. He wasn't lost. He wasn't wandering. He was listening. I lowered myself in the driver's seat, minimizing movement. He stepped forward. One deliberate pace. The ground vibrated beneath him. He smiled. It wasn't wide or theatrical, just subtle confirmation. Then he walked toward Site 17. Each step evenly spaced. Each answered from below. He wasn't afraid. He was conducting something. My mind tried to assemble explanations. Researcher, survey team member, trespasser like me. But none of those explanations accounted for the way he adjusted his stride slightly, then returned to a steady rhythm, as if testing response times. He reached the center of the original triangle formed by Sites 12, 14, and 17, and began to clap. Slow, measured, one clap every 2 seconds. The ground beneath him pulsed. I saw it this time. The soil shifted inward, not collapsing, contracting, like muscle tightening beneath skin. The man tilted his head slightly, listening for feedback only he seemed able to interpret. Then he stopped clapping. Silence. He crouched and pressed his palm to the dirt, and whispered something I couldn't hear. The ground tremored once, then went still. He stood, brushed off his hands, and walked back toward the forest. No flashlight, no hurry, just steady steps fatting into the trees. I didn't move for several minutes. When I finally stepped out of the vehicle, I made sure my pace was irregular. The triangle clearing felt different now. Charged, the soil in the center bore faint depressions in a circular formation. Not footprints, indentations, as if something below had pressed upward. Carefully, I knelt near Site 14 and placed my ear close to the ground. Nothing, no tapping, no vibration, but the silence felt intentional. Like restraint, the acoustic logs flashed through my memory. Pattern response observed. Signal appears reactive. Resonance no longer localized. Localized meant confined to the triangle. No longer localized meant it had expanded. But how far? And why was that man encouraging it? The disappearances suddenly aligned in a way they hadn't before. Hikers follow trails. Trails create rhythm. Footsteps in sequence. Families walking together. Voices overlapping in predictable intervals. Sound carries differently in pine forests. Long trunks, sparse undergrowth. Vibration travels. What if the disappearances weren't attacks? What if they were responses to completed triangulations? The entity below didn't lash out randomly. It waited until it had mapped the source, then acted with precision. That would explain the lack of struggle reports. No torn clothing found miles away. No blood, just absence. I returned to the lodge and reopened the binder. The early acoustic logs contained diagrams I had overlooked. They weren't just frequency charts. They were spatial grids, coordinates marking where the strongest resonance converged. At first, all within the triangle. Later entries showed widening arcs. Eventually, the grid expanded beyond the campground boundary, toward the surrounding region, toward hiking trails, toward rural roads. The final note I hadn't fully processed earlier now seemed unmistakable. Resonance no longer localized. It hadn't spread accidentally. It had learned to extend its range. And someone was still feeding it data. The man in the trees wasn't random. He understood the mechanism. He was training it. But to what end? I didn't sleep. At 3:12 a.m., the tapping returned beneath the lodge. Soft, exploratory. I stood motionless. It intensified slightly. I realized slowly that my heartbeat was steady, regular, predictable. I forced myself to breathe irregularly. Hold, exhale, hold longer, shift weight unpredictably. The tapping faltered, then faded. It wasn't just external rhythm. It was any consistent pattern, even internal ones transmitted through contact. The horror sharpened into something colder. If it could detect cadence through ground resonance, then humans were effectively broadcasting their position at all times, unless they disrupted their own patterns. The disappearances weren't acts of aggression. They were the result of perfect detection. The man understood that, which meant he also knew how to avoid it, and how to weaponize it. At dawn, I found footprints near the tree line where he had stood. Deep impressions. He had planted his feet firmly during his clapping experiment, encouraging amplification, testing latency. This wasn't superstition. It was behavioral conditioning of something beneath us. I followed the direction of his retreat for several yards into the forest. The ground felt normal there. No damp soil, no stakes, no wiring. But I found something else. A narrow trench, partially concealed by pine needles, running parallel to the campground boundary. It extended farther than I could see. Old conduit, electrical cabling, buried intentionally, leading away from Briar Hollow, toward the surrounding region. The campground hadn't been trying to contain the resonance. It had been trying to study it, harness it. The stakes at the triangle weren't barriers. They were sensors. And when the logs noted resonance no longer localized, it didn't mean it had escaped. It meant it had been guided outward. Deliberately. The disappearances weren't failures. They were proof of concept, I stepped back slowly, pulse irregular by design. Someone had discovered something beneath Briar Hollow, something that interpreted rhythm as signal. And instead of sealing it off, they had built an interface. The man in the forest was continuing the work, refining it, teaching it to recognize human cadence at greater distances, which meant every road with traffic, every hiking trail, every small town gathering was data. And I had filmed here, walked here, generated hours of structured vibration, teaching it too. The final realization came quietly. If the entity required pattern vibration to locate a source, then broadcasting a consistent, amplified rhythm could draw it anywhere. Anywhere with sufficient ground transmission. A highway, a town square, a building foundation. All it would take is coordinated cadence. Marching, clapping, music with a heavy bass line. The disappearances weren't the goal. They were calibration. And the man in the trees wasn't hiding from it. He was orchestrating it. The tapping began again. Not beneath the triangle, not beneath the lodge, but beneath me, where I stood in the forest. Soft, curious, responsive. It had extended its range, and I had just confirmed its success. I forced myself to move without rhythm. Step, pause, shift, uneven stride. The tapping struggled to synchronize, then faded, but it had found me. Without the triangle, without the sensors, the learning phase was over. It no longer needed containment structures. It had internalized the pattern recognition. I returned to my vehicle slowly, deliberately disrupting every natural cadence. The clearing felt smaller now. Not physically, strategically. The campground was only the origin point. The real structure was the network extending outward. And somewhere beyond the trees, the man was still testing, still refining. The final reveal didn't come as a shock. It came as inevitability. The reason the campground looked paused instead of vandalized. The reason there were no public investigations into the disappearances beyond routine reports. The reason the closure cited environmental concerns instead of hazard. Because this wasn't rogue. It wasn't secret. It was sanctioned. A system that could identify and localize any human based solely on vibrational cadence. That wasn't a horror to those in power. It was surveillance. Perfect, untraceable, and self-correcting. The disappearances weren't accidents. They were removals, testing the limits of detection, refining selectivity. And Briar Hollow was just the prototype site. The tapping beneath my feet returned one last time. Stronger, confident, not searching, recognizing. I stopped moving completely. The vibration intensified. Not aggressive, anticipatory, as if waiting for confirmation of pattern completion. My heart betrayed me. Steady, regular, human. The ground tightened. I forced myself into a rhythmic breathing again. Staggered pulse, shifted weight unpredictably. The vibration faltered, then slowly receded. It had nearly mapped me fully. Nearly, which meant the only reason I was still standing there was because I understood its logic. For now, I left Briar Hollow without accelerating smoothly onto the highway. No steady engine hum. No predictable tire rhythm. I varied speed deliberately, took uneven back roads, drove like someone trying not to be tracked by something that didn't use sight. Because that's exactly what I was. And even now, weeks later, I avoid metronomes. Avoid packing when I think. Avoid tapping my fingers. Because once you understand that something beneath the ground listens for patterns, you realize how much of being human is rhythm, and how easy it is to become locatable. The disappearances are still happening. Scattered, unexplained. Authorities call them unrelated. Coincidence. But I know better. Because sometimes, late at night, when I lie too still for too long, I feel the faintest vibration beneath the floorboards. Not searching anymore. Just confirming. As if something far below is keeping time. Waiting for me to slip back into rhythm and finish the pattern. If this story unsettled you, let me know by leaving a like. And if you want more slow burn horror that lingers long after the screen goes dark, subscribe and stay with me. Just try not to walk in a straight line on your way out.